feel extremely honored to be invited by the US Naval Academy to give a talk about my own journey towards the understanding of Mao Zedong, the most important figure in 20th century China. I was born in 1952, 3 years after Mao took power. When I was growing up, Mao isolated China from the outside world. In our mind, the West, and particularly America, was this terrifying place. I mean, you know, in the nursery schools, I remember if we wouldn't eat up our food, our teachers would say, think of all the starving children in America. And when the boys played guerrilla warfare, which was the equivalent of cowboys and Indians, the baddies would always have rose thorns glued onto their noses to show they were Americans, because the Chinese think the Americans have longer and sharper noses than the Chinese. And the baddies would say hello all the time, because in propaganda films, evil Americans were always drinking Coca-Cola and saying hello. So we all thought hello was a swear word. So in this very sealed off world, Mao brainwashed the Chinese population to create his own personality cult. I mean, when we were children, Mao was like our God. If we wanted to say what I say is true, we would say, I swear to Chairman Mao. There was a song that every child in China learned to sing. It went, father is close, mother is close, but neither is as close as Chairman Mao. And when the teachers wanted us to work harder, they would say, if you work hard, you'll be able to go to Beijing to see Chairman Mao when you grow up. So when I was 14, I went on this pilgrimage to Beijing to try to see Mao. I didn't see him clearly. I only caught a glimpse of his back. I was so heartbroken that for a fleeting moment, I thought perhaps I should commit suicide. But it was in that year, when I was 14, in 1966, that my faith in Mao began to wane. And this was because that year, Mao launched his violent cultural revolution, which was really his great purge. And tens of millions of Chinese were victimized and persecuted. And all around me, the place was full of violence and atrocities. For example, in virtually every school in China, teachers were designated as enemies. And I saw my teachers being subject to those, you know, ghastly denunciation meetings. Basically, the victim would be stood on the stage and their arms were ferociously pushed up and put up, and their heads would be fiercely pushed down, and they would be kicked and beaten up. And also children from what was called in those days the families of class enemies were also made victims. And I witnessed a girl from my school who was accused of, from such a family background, jumping from upstairs window in an attempt to kill herself. My parents were communists, and they joined the communists when they were teenagers. But in the Cultural Revolution, my father spoke openly against the Cultural Revolution, and he wrote to Mao to protest against the Cultural Revolution. As a result, he was arrested, tortured, driven insane. He was exiled to a camp and died tragically and prematurely. My mother was under tremendous pressure to denounce my father. She refused, and as a result, she was put through over 100 of those ghastly denunciation meetings which went on every day. And my mother was made to kneel on broken glass. She was paraded in the streets where children spat at her and threw stones at her. She was exiled to a camp. Luckily, she survived. And all over China, books were burned, and everything to do with culture in people's homes and open public places were destined for destruction. Writing became extremely dangerous. On my 16th birthday in 1968, I wrote my first poem, but I had to flush it down the toilet because my father's persecutors had come to raid our apartment. And afterwards, I thought to myself, you know, we've always been told that communist China is paradise on earth. But if this is paradise, what then is hell? And that was the first time I openly questioned in my mind, questioned the society I was living in. But I didn't question Mao. The personality cult of Mao had given him this godlike status and made it impossible even for me even to contemplate his name. So instead, I blamed people around him, particularly his wife, Madame Mao. And many years later, in 1974, a friend secretly gave me a copy of the magazine Newsweek. She somehow had just got hold of this magazine. And I had just learned a little English. By then, universities in China, which had been closed for many years, were just beginning to open, and I was able to get into Sichuan University. So I read this magazine, and there was an article about China, and there was a little picture of Mao and a little picture of Madame Mao. And the caption says, Madame Mao is Mao's eyes, ears, and mouth. Suddenly, it was like a tightly closed window, suddenly being thrown open. And Mao's name was spelled out for me. And I thought to myself, of course, Mao was responsible. He was responsible for all these death and suffering. How could I not have realized that? You know, I was a reasonably intelligent person, but it had taken me 8 years to come to this conclusion. Such is the power of brainwashing. In 1976, Mao died. In 1978, for the first time in the history of communist China, scholarships for going abroad were awarded on academic basis. I sat for a national exam, I did reasonably well, so I became one of the first group of 14 people to go to Britain and to study in Britain. And as far as I know, I was the first person to get out of my province, Sichuan province, the province of Professor Yu and this other professor, a province then of 90 million people, to leave China and study in the West. I was so lucky that when I got my doctorate in linguistics in 1982, from the University of York in England, I became the first person from communist China to get a doctorate from a British university. In the early 1990s, my memoir, Wild Swans, the story of my grandmother, my mother, and myself, was published. And I was thinking about my next book. Mao seemed to be the obvious subject. He dominated my early life, and I saw him turning the lives of a quarter of the world's population upside down. And yet I felt the world knew astonishingly little about him. And I myself had many unanswered questions. And my husband, John Halliday, was also interested in Mao, so we embarked on this project together. We divided our research by language. And because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And John, unfortunately, speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And particularly, he knows Russian and loved working in the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove. And in that decade of research about Mao, we traveled around the world in pursuit of information about Mao. We searched the world's archives. We were the first outsiders to get into the Albanian archive, because during the Cultural Revolution, tiny Albania was China's only ally. And we interviewed hundreds of people. And in China, we talked to Mao's family, friends, relatives, colleagues, their widows, and staff. And most of them talked for the first time. And outside China, we interviewed virtually anyone who had interesting or significant dealings with Mao, from Henry Kissinger to George Bush, the senior, to the Dalai Lama, to Imelda Marcos. Do you know this former Filipino first lady who had thousands of pairs of shoes? And she flirted with Mao because Mao was a womanizer. And she also, during our 5 hours interview, batted her eyelids furiously at John, my John. And she complained to me that Western men simply don't understand us Eastern women. And so John said, do you know any Western men who understand you? And she said, only one person, Richard Nixon. I don't know whether you remember this person, this tyrant of Zaire, now Congo, Mobutu. We got to interview him in very unusual circumstances, because Mobutu had some tyrant-to-tyrant tete-a-tetes with Mao. Mao had tried to overthrow him, even to have you killed, as Mao told him during the rapprochement. And when we were in Hong Kong 1 year after doing our interviews in mainland China, and John was in the bathroom reading the local newspaper, he suddenly yelled. He said, guess who is in the hotel? It's Mobutu. He said, shall we try to get somebody to introduce us? And I said, oh, John, I've done 2-month interviews. I'm exhausted. I'm going to the hair salon. So I went to the hair salon, and 10 minutes later, who but Mobutu strutted in. He was sitting, like where this chair is, and he was under this hair thing. He had the bits of cotton wools around his head. He had the bits of a bit of towel around his neck, and he was trapped. So I was able to approach him when I was led to have my hair rinsed, and I asked him for an interview, and that's how we got a unique interview with Mobutu. Now, I wanted to go back, when we start writing this book, just wanted to go back a little bit about my first days when I arrived in London, in England. And England, of course, was like another planet. And everything was so different. And in those days, we had to move, we the Chinese, the group of 14 people, had to move in a group. And we were all wearing these Mao suits, this sort of blue jacket and the blue trousers, and we were quite a sight in the London streets. And we were also told by the embassy not to do this, that, and the other. And one thing we were particularly told not to do was to go into a bar, because the Chinese translation for bar, 酒吧, in those days suggested somewhere indecent with nude women gyrating. Of course, I was torn with curiosity. And I had spotted this bar across the road from our college. And one day, I sneaked out of the college. I darted across the road. I pushed the door open. I walked in. Of course, I saw nothing of the kind, only some old men sitting there drinking beer. And I was rather disappointed, of course. And I, in those, first exciting years, I broke so many rules. And one last taboo to break was to have an English boyfriend. I had come from China with a cautionary tale in my head, which I firmly believed, which was anyone who had a foreign lover would be carted off back to China in a jute sack and drugged. So when I was anywhere near the Chinese embassy, my legs would turn into jelly, and if I was in a car, I would shrink down in the seat, so my head would disappear from the window, so nobody could see me. And it was then I first learned to use makeup, because I believed it would provide a satisfactory disguise from the embassy. And of course, I don't think the Chinese embassy in those days were doing that kind of surveillance, which I imagined, because China was changing. But I had grown up under Mao, and the fear had been deeply embedded in my heart. So now, even though I knew something about life under Mao, even though I lived under him, I thought I knew more than the average person. But still, after 10 years research, an entirely somehow new Mao emerged. I mean, there were so many things that were surprising to me, that were shocking to me. I think one of the more most unexpected things that we discovered was that Mao's single-minded goal after he took power in China was to turn China into a military superpower so he could dominate the world. I don't think anyone at that time had this idea about Mao. But to fulfill his ambition, Mao wanted to build a first-class arms industry. And in order to achieve that, he turned to Stalin. Stalin was aware of Mao's ambitions, and Stalin did not want to build up a rival. And in order to convince Stalin that he was 100% committed to Stalin's leadership, Mao cut off all relations with the West and refused diplomatic recognition from America at a time when America was actually ready to recognize Mao's China. And to use, Mao made it, it has been thought that the US refused to recognize Mao's China when Mao took power. But in fact, it was Mao who made recognition impossible, to force out Western diplomats. That was Mao's order. But Stalin was still wary of Mao and declined to sell him the arms industries Mao coveted. It was in order to waggle these industries out of Stalin, and in particular to get Stalin to help him build a nuclear bomb, that Mao helped instigate the Korean War. Mao's calculation was this: Stalin's goal was to weaken America and expand the boundaries of the communist camp. And Mao offered Stalin the very thing Stalin lacked, boundless manpower. Russia was short of manpower, and Stalin was cautious about committing Russian troops. And Mao offered Stalin the millions of dispensable Chinese. Mao told Stalin that his plan was, I quote, to spend several years consuming, several hundred thousand American lives, so they will back down. Mao knew that, unlike himself, America cared about body bags. In return for this service, Mao wanted Stalin to sell him the arms industries. The Korean War eventually enabled Mao to squeeze out of Stalin the basis of an aircraft industry and the technology transfers for producing several kinds of small arms. But at least 400,000 Chinese, probably up to 1 million, died in the war. After Stalin's death in 1953, Soviet leader Khrushchev was willing to sell Mao some arms industries. Mao's shopping list was very long, as he aimed at becoming the boss of the world, which he said was to have the world listen to me. In his lifetime was all Mao cared for. Mao scorned posterity. When he visited Lenin's mausoleum in 1950, he said to his entourage that all this splendor, solemn splendor surrounding Lenin's mausoleum, it's all very well for us, but there is nothing in it for Lenin. He's dead. He doesn't feel a thing. Mao only wanted tangible power and glory, which he could enjoy while he was still alive. So he tried to buy all the top-end military industries and equipment all at once. And these purchases were extremely expensive, of course. And how was he going to pay for them? Mao paid with food. His core policy boiled down to squeezing every possible item of grain out of his people to buy arms industries. Mao knew his people were dependent on this food for survival. China was not able to produce enough food to feed itself. It had been a food importer for 100 years. And even so, the Chinese were living on the knife edge. Now suddenly, food was exported on a massive scale. The result was that nearly 38 million people died of starvation at the height of Mao's buying spree between 1958 and 1961 in the so-called Great Leap Forward. In fact, the biggest famine in world history. If the food exported had been used to feed the Chinese, not a single one of the 38 million would have had to die. To be more precise, we estimated in Mao biography that 37,670,000 people died of starvation in those 4 years. In September 2005, 3 months after the publication of our book, the Chinese government felt obliged to tell a small group of officials its own classified figure for the death in this famine, and it was 37,558,000, which was virtually identical to ours. Mao had foreseen that exporting massive amount of food was going to cause massive death before the famine started. He prepared his top echelon by telling them that they should not be so bothered Mao said there should be celebration rallies when people die. We believe in dialectics, and so we can't not be in favor of death. When tens of millions of people are dying, Mao said things like, having only 3 leaves to eat, so what? Educate the peasants to eat less. Death have benefits. They can fertilize the land. So in many places, dead peasants were just buried in the farmland and the crops were planted on top. And Mao even said to his top echelon that for all his projects to take off, half of China may well have to die. That this greatest famine in the history of the world took place was no news in itself. But even Mao's critics would only go as far as charging him with economic mismanagement. And this is what I myself thought when I wrote Wild Swans. But the research John and I did in those more than 10 years have convinced me that Mao knowingly consigned tens of millions of his own people to death by starvation, which amounts to slow torture. And we discovered his motive. Now, with Khrushchev's help, Mao built up a sizable arms industry, including an atomic bomb, which was exploded in 1964. But all the while, Mao aspired to supplant Moscow as the leader of the communist camp. For many years, he held back from openly challenging Khrushchev because he needed Russia. And in 1963, Khrushchev signed what amounted to a nuclear non-proliferation treaty with America and Britain, and committed not to help any other country to make the bomb. So Khrushchev became useless to Mao. Mao split from Russia and denounced Khrushchev by name and set up his own Maoist camp. Losing the crucial Russian know-how, China's arms industries were in a shambles, despite consuming a huge proportion of the nation's investment for nearly 2 decades. Mao was forced to turn to America in order to get a kiss of life for his arms industries. And this was one major reason why he invited Richard Nixon to China in 1972. Mao told Kim Il-sung, North Korea's then leader and the father of today's dear leader, the only objective of these relations is to obtain developed technology. Mao pulled the wool over the eyes of Nixon and Kissinger, but he ultimately did not get what he wanted. And for this failure, Mao blamed Watergate. Watergate was then threatening Nixon's presidency and made it impossible for Nixon to take any big risks. Mao railed relentlessly against Watergate. He said to Kissinger, "What's all this farting was about, the Watergate?" He demanded from visiting statesmen, "What's wrong with having a tape recorder? Do rulers not have a right to rule?" Mao developed a sentimental affection for Nixon. When he knew he was going to die, the person he most wanted to see was Richard Nixon. And in February 1976, 7 months before Mao died, he sent a Boeing 707 all the way from China to Los Angeles to fetch Nixon. And when Nixon came, Mao clinked teacups with him to say goodbye. And when Nixon took his leave, Mao struggled to his feet and walked Nixon to the door. And Mao stood there watching Nixon go, looking immensely melancholy. Of course, Nixon had made Mao glamorous in the mainstream of the West since his first visit in 1972. Mao became an international icon. Andy Warhol painted him, and even Chinese spittoon. You know what a spittoon is? Yeah. Even the Chinese spittoon, which Mao was seen to be using when he was having his meeting with Nixon, became a fashion item. After I came to the West, I once went to a friend's place for lunch, and when the salad was served, it came in a spittoon. Can you imagine how the lunch was? People often say that Nixon opened the door of China, but he didn't. A few Westerners did get into China under draconian control, but for all but a few Chinese, the country remained a tightly sealed prison. I myself was actually one of the few privileged Chinese to be able to lay our hands on half a dozen contemporary Western books that had been translated into Chinese and published in strictly classified editions. And one book was Nixon's own 6 Crises, even though large hunks were cut out. Another book was The Winds of War by Herman Wouk, from which I caught my first glimpse of the US Navy and the lovely clothes available to Chinese women. I must say I was far more excited by the latter than by the former. Well, while showering sentimental affection on Nixon, who after all was the former president of the United States, which was supposed to be China's #1 enemy, Mao was unbelievably nasty to his own comrades. For example, Zhou Enlai, Mao's prime minister, had served him faithfully and like a slave for decades. But in 1972, Zhou Enlai, by the way, I don't know, some of you might not have even heard of him now. I mean, he was in these days considered this great charmer. And Kissinger said to us that Zhou Enlai was the most impressive statesman he had ever met. And another American diplomat compared him to Humphrey Bogart. But Zhou Enlai was a slave to Mao. And in 1972, just after Nixon's visit, Zhou Enlai was diagnosed of having cancer of the bladder. It was at a very early stage, the cancer, and he could easily have been cured. But Mao gave orders to doctors not to treat Zhou Enlai. And Mao wanted Zhou Enlai, who was 4 years younger than himself, and who was in excellent general health, to die before him. Zhou Enlai died in January 1976, 8 months before Mao. Now, most tyrants have a small, warm, some corner in their heart for their family, for their children. But I was astonished to realize that this was not the case with Mao. Mao's eldest son, An Yin, died in the Korean War. Mao was told about it, but no one told An Yin's young widow for 2.5 years. While the war was going on, she accepted the silence because she was used to party secrecy. But after the war ended, the Korean War ended, in summer 1953, when she still didn't hear from him, she found this very strange, and she asked Mao, who told her. She fainted. she did not have the slightest idea that her husband had died, because during those 2.5 years, she was constantly seeing Mao. And she was with Mao for on all her vacations and the weekends. And Mao didn't show the slightest sign of sadness. I mean, there was nothing, not even a flicker of something that would have given her some sort of inkling that her husband had died. And Mao even joked about his dead son as though he were still alive. Mao was married 4 times. His second wife, Yang Kai-hui, he often said was the love of his life. But in fact, as we discovered from unseen manuscripts, which she wrote many years ago, Mao had actually abandoned her, together with their 3 young sons, the youngest only 4-month-old. And when she was in danger of being arrested and executed because of her connection with Mao, Mao could easily have saved her, but he didn't lift a finger, so she was executed. And Mao's last wife was this notorious Madame Mao, who many today still blame for what happened in the Cultural Revolution. In fact, I mean, she never made any policies, and it was Mao who used her. Mao knew she was full of venom, and Mao once said to a family member, "Jiang Qing is full of venom like a scorpion." Mao wriggled his little finger to imitate a scorpion. So Mao used her to do his dirty work, and he knew everybody hated her. In the last year or 2 of Mao's death, he was very ill and he felt vulnerable. He was terrified of a coup. So he said to his army commanders, "You know, you are welcome to get rid of my wife and her gang, as long as you leave me to die in my bed." And this was exactly what happened. Mao died in his bed, and less than a month later, Madame Mao and the rest of the gang of 4 were arrested. And Madame Mao later committed suicide in prison. Now, Mao was, during his 27-year rule, Mao was responsible for well over the death of 70 million Chinese in peacetime. And yet today, his portrait is still hanging on Tiananmen Gate in the heart of the Chinese capital. His corpse is still dominating Tiananmen Square, and his face is still on Chinese banknotes. And the current regime still declares itself to be Mao's heir, and is determined to perpetuate the myth of Mao. In fact, I think more so today than any time in the past 30 years. Both of my books, Wild Swans and Mao, The Unknown Story, are banned in mainland China. And the information about these books on the internet is vigilantly blocked or deleted by China's vast internet police. The regime hires an army of what it calls internet commentators to guide public opinion, to use the regime's word, public opinion expressed on the internet. These commentators are popularly known as Mao 50 cents for the amount they apparently get paid for writing each piece. So if there is something, about our book or myself on the internet, there will be, in the comments section, a flood of abuse and disgusting, the nastiest and the most disgusting abuse, including death threats. And I know they are done by the 50 cents because there is nothing, there is no argument, there is only abuses and obscenities, and the Cultural Revolution type expressions like a horrible death to you who dare to oppose our great leader, Chairman Mao. Mao's shadow still looms large in China, in the rising superpower of the 21st century. What is going to happen in China and to the world? And I myself will be watching that space on Tiananmen Gate. The day Mao's portrait is taken down will be the day when the new China is born. Only when that day comes can China become a really good country to its own people and a benign force in the world. Thank you very much.